Hi everyone, my name is Asyraf, my metric number is 192184, and I'm going to present to you about legitimacy theory. So first, before we look at what legitimacy theory is all about, let us first look at the purpose of the theory. Some organizations, they provide disclosures in their financial statements regarding the social and environmental impacts that their operations have on society and the environment. These disclosures are called social and environmental disclosures. They're also called CSR disclosures, corporate social responsibility disclosures. An example of a CSR disclosure would be, let's say, an organization discloses the level of greenhouse gas that it emits to the atmosphere as a result of its operations. That would be an example of a CSR disclosure. Not all organizations provide CSR disclosures in their financial statements, but most of the big companies do provide these kind of disclosures in their financial statements. However, the thing about this kind of disclosures is that it is not mandatory for the organizations to provide these disclosures in their financial statements. It is voluntary for them to do so, meaning if they do not want to provide those disclosures, they don't have to do it. And another thing with these disclosures is that it is not cheap for organizations to provide these disclosures because, let's say, an organization wants to disclose the level of greenhouse gas that it emits. First, it has to know the amount of greenhouse gas that it emits. In order to do that, it has to measure the amount of greenhouse gas it emits, and measuring that is not cheap for the organization. So organizations, they want to reduce costs, right? Because they want to increase their profits. So if providing these disclosures is going to make them incur more costs, and they don't want to incur more costs, so why do they provide these disclosures if it is not mandatory for them to do so? So that is exactly the purpose of this theory, which is to study managers' motivations for providing these disclosures even though they are not mandatory for the organization to provide. Because there must be a reason, right, why organizations provide these disclosures even if these disclosures are not mandatory for them. Next, let's look at the origin of legitimacy theory. Legitimacy theory is an accounting theory, but it originates from institutional theory, which is not an accounting theory. Institutional theory is an organizational theory. So legitimacy, not legitimacy theory, but the concept of legitimacy is a key component of institutional theory. So in coming up with legitimacy theory, the early legitimacy theorists, the first researchers who came up with this theory, they borrowed aspects of institutional theory. They don't borrow a lot of it, they only borrow certain aspects of institutional theory because institutional theory is very broad. And in borrowing those aspects of institutional theory, they also simplified those aspects in order to come up with a simple theory. So as a result of that, legitimacy theory is a simple theory to understand and also to employ and test in studies as it makes some simplifying assumptions that I will explain in a moment. However, a shortcoming of being simple is that although legitimacy theory is able to explain to a certain extent managers' motivations for providing voluntary CSR disclosures, it is not able to give a deep and comprehensive understanding of the voluntary disclosure phenomenon. So like we are able to understand certain things, but we are not able to understand the complete picture as a result of the theory being simple. However, it also helps us to understand at least those few things rather than not being able to understand anything at all. Next, let us talk about the concept of legitimacy. So, what is legitimacy? An organization is considered to be legitimate if society perceives that its operations conform with the expectations and values of society. Meaning, if society thinks that the organization's operations is according to the expectations and values, then they will consider that organization as being legitimate. The opposite is also true. If society thinks that an organization's operations do not conform to their expectations and values, they will consider that organization to be illegitimate, the opposite of legitimate. So why is it important for organizations to be considered as legitimate? Well, under legitimacy theory, organizations are considered to not have an inherent right to resources such as raw materials, labor, and capital. So who has the right to these resources? Society. So in order for organizations, because they need these resources for their operations, isn't it? So in order for them to be able to use these resources which belongs to society, they have to obtain permission from society to use these resources. And society will only give permission to organizations if they consider those organizations as legitimate. So that is why it is important for organizations to be considered as legitimate by society. So if you look at it that way, then we can look at legitimacy as being a resource itself to organizations, because without it, without legitimacy, organizations won't be able to access all the other resources such as raw materials, labor, and capital that it needs, that they need for their operations. Next, let us look at the concept of social contract. This is another important concept in legitimacy theory. So what is the social contract? The social contract is a hypothetical contract that is agreed upon by organizations and society. So it is not a real contract. There is no black and white. We can look at the social contract as an understanding between organizations and society in terms of what they have to do for each other, in terms of their commitments towards each other. So this social contract, it implies that both organizations and society have certain obligations that they have to fulfill under this social contract. So what are these obligations? For organizations, they have to make sure that their operations conform to the expectations and values of society. And in exchange for that, society will permit them to use the resources that they need for their operations. So the terms in this social contract are both explicit and implicit. The explicit terms are the laws and regulations in a country that organizations have to adhere to, while the implicit terms are the expectations and values of society. So organizations have to adhere to these terms in order to be granted permission to use the resources by society. Next, legitimacy is in the eye of the beholder. So what is meant by that? Legitimacy is based on how society perceives an organization, not on the actual performance of the organization. Meaning, organization can manipulate society into perceiving it as being legitimate, regardless of its actual performance. Like even though, let's say, an organization doesn't actually conform, its operations doesn't actually conform to the expectations and values of society, it can still manipulate society into thinking that it is legitimate. So legitimacy is based on how society perceives an organization, not on the actual performance of the organization. So how can an organization manipulate society into thinking that it is legitimate? It can do this by employing legitimizing strategies, which are strategies that can make an organization appears to be legitimate. So there are a lot of legitimizing strategies One such strategy is by providing social and environmental disclosures in the financial statements. So the provision of social and environmental disclosures is the subject of study, is the focus of legitimacy theory. It wants to study why organizations do this. Next, let us look at the simplifying assumptions that are made by legitimacy theory. Just now, I mentioned that the early legitimacy theories, they borrow aspects of institutional theory and they simplify those aspects. So these are the simplifying assumptions that are made by legitimacy theory. So firstly, legitimacy theory assumes that an organization is either legitimate or illegitimate, meaning it cannot be both legitimate and illegitimate at the same time. Secondly, legitimacy theory assumes that legitimacy is entirely dependent on conformance with society's expectations and values, meaning as long as organizations conform to society's expectations and values, they will be granted legitimacy by society. So there are no other factors that come into play when determining whether an organization will get legitimacy from society. Thirdly, it is assumed that everyone in society has the same power to influence organizations, regardless of their status, income, and others. Everyone has the same power to influence the actions of organizations. As will be seen later, we can see that this is obviously not true. Number 4, it is assumed that society's expectations are comprised in this social contract. What is meant by this is that in actuality, in the real world, it is hard for organizations to know exactly what are the expectations of society. This is because there are many parts of society, right? Many stakeholder groups. So it is hard for organizations to know what exactly are the expectations of each of these stakeholder groups. That is the first one, the first thing. The second one is that expectations of society actually changes over time. So it is hard for organizations to know the expectations of society exactly. However, this theory assumes that organizations know the expectations and values of society. Number 5, it is assumed that both parties will honor the social contract, meaning as long as the other party honors their part of the contract, then that party, the other party, will also honor their part of the contract. Next, it is assumed that the occurrence of a social or environmental crisis will result in a breach of the social contract, which will create legitimacy gaps, meaning an organization might lose its legitimacy in the eyes of society. And it is also assumed that these legitimacy gaps will be addressed by managers. In the real world, most of the time this is the case. The legitimacy gaps will be addressed by managers, but sometimes it is not necessarily the case. Sometimes managers won't address legitimacy gaps. Number 7, it is assumed under legitimacy theory, since that is the subject of study of the theory, it is assumed that in addressing the legitimacy gaps, managers will provide CSR disclosures. Actually, there are other legitimizing strategies that can be employed, but since the provision of CSR disclosures is the subject of this study, then it assumes that managers will employ this specific legitimizing strategy, which is the provision of CSR disclosures. Number 8, it is assumed that managers provide CSR disclosures in their financial statements solely for their survival or profitability instead of as a result of a feeling of accountability or responsibility for their actions. Obviously, in the real world, it is not always the case. This is not always the case. I believe that some managers, they do provide CSR disclosures as a result of their feeling of accountability for their actions. But nevertheless, under legitimacy theory, this is the assumption that it makes. And lastly, legitimacy theory assumes that managers' motivations are similar all around the world, regardless of their nationality, culture, and institutional context. Again, as will be seen in a moment, this is also not true. So, as you will see, some of these simplifying assumptions are not exactly accurate in the real world, and that is the trade-off that you have to make when you want to make things simple. Sometimes it is not accurate. Next, let us look at the applications of legitimacy theory. Actually, there are, of course, many applications of legitimacy theory. It has been employed in many studies with varying results. The first study that I'm going to talk about is the study by Deegan and Rankin, which who analyzed disclosures of 40 Australian companies, some of which are prosecuted for breaching environmental protection laws. This study wants to find out whether there are any differences between the disclosures of companies that have been prosecuted and those that haven't been prosecuted. So they found that organizations tend not to disclose adverse environmental impacts of their operations, meaning if their operations resulted in something bad for the environment, they tend not to disclose that in their financial statements. Second, they also found that prosecuted organizations tend to disclose the environmental initiatives that they have done, while the organizations that have not been prosecuted tend not to disclose the environmental initiatives that they have done. So why is this the case? When an organization is being prosecuted, it has breached the social contract because it has breached environmental protection laws, right? Which is against the expectations and values of society. So when it has breached the social contract, legitimacy gaps are created. It might have lost some of its, or maybe all of it, legitimacy, all of its legitimacy. So it discloses the environmental initiatives that it has done in order to regain back the legitimacy that it has lost. So that is why prosecuted organizations tend to disclose their environmental initiatives in their financial statements. So as a conclusion, Deegan and Rankin concluded that the voluntary CSR disclosures that are made by organizations tend to not represent the actual environmental performance of those organizations. Next, Chu et al. Studies the greenhouse gas reporting of the top 100 Chinese companies in the Shanghai Stock Exchange. Similar to the finding of Deegan and Rankin, they found that organizations tend to only disclose neutral or good news in their financial statements while not disclosing bad news. They also found that when disclosing environmental information, the disclosures tend to be narrative rather than factual in nature, meaning the disclosures are wordy and doesn't contain a lot of facts, a lot of numbers. So this might suggest that the organization is trying to hide something because usually when we present narratives to others, we want to convince them of something which might not be true. If we have nothing to hide, we should present facts, numbers to people, isn't it? So by having the disclosures be more narrative than factual, it might suggest that those organizations might have something to hide in terms of their environmental performance. Next, they also found that organization size and industry influence their degree of environmental disclosures. Organizations bigger organizations in high carbon emission industries have been found to provide more disclosures than smaller organizations in low carbon emission industries. Again, this relates to the concept of legitimacy gaps. Usually, bigger firms, bigger organizations get more attention from the public, and bigger firms in high carbon emission industries, they tend to kind of like get a lot of bad publicity for their environmental impacts, which will result in legitimacy gaps, which would have to be regained or overcome by providing more disclosures regarding their environmental initiatives. And Chu et al. Also found that organizations' profitability doesn't influence the degree of disclosures, which is contrary to the assumption that is made by legitimacy theory. So in recent years, there have been some updates that have been made to legitimacy theory, which improves the theory and also overcome some of its shortcomings in terms of the simplifying assumptions that it makes. So firstly, Mutake et al. Suggests that the degree of organizations' political connectivity with the government inversely affects the degree of disclosures that they provide. This is because the organizations perceive that the political connection that they have with the government is able to deter pressure from other stakeholder groups. So this finding is contrary to the assumption that is made by legitimacy theory that everyone in society has the same power or influence over the actions of organizations. This is because under legitimacy theory, government is part of society, but as this study shows, government has more influence than other parts of society, than other stakeholder groups. So Mutake et al. Also found that organizations that are more export-oriented tend to provide more CSR disclosures in order to mitigate pressure from their overseas buyers, which again shows that not everyone in society has the same power over the actions of organizations. Next, De Villiers and Marquez suggest that organizations operating in more democratic countries with more effective governments, higher quality regulations, more investor protection, and more press freedom tend to provide more CSR disclosures in their financial statements. And Al-Razi et al. Suggests that the degree of a country's commitment towards the environment affects the level of CSR disclosures that organizations in that country operates. So both of these studies show that the context in which organizations operate can and does influence the level of CSR disclosures that organizations provide, which is contrary to the assumption made by legitimacy theory. Bellucci and Manetti suggest that researchers must not only focus on the financial statements and must also focus on other reporting media, such as social media, when studying disclosures of companies. This is because more and more companies have been using other media, such as social media, to disclose or to communicate information to their stakeholders. It is found that social media can be used for more effective two-way communications between organizations and their stakeholders. Hence, only studying financial statements and not looking at other reporting media may not give the complete picture regarding the disclosure activities of organizations. And lastly, Lupo and Sandu suggest that organizations' disclosures or communications with stakeholders are not mutually exclusive. There are interrelationships among the disclosures or communications that influence the effectiveness of the legitimizing strategy as a whole, and also each of those disclosures, and communications. So the disclosures and communications that an organization have with its stakeholders have to be consistent with each other to improve their effectiveness. So as a conclusion, legitimacy theory is a theory which is trying to explain managers' motivations for providing voluntary CSR disclosures. It originates from institutional theory and it borrows aspects of it. It also makes simplifying assumptions. It simplified those aspects of institutional theory that it borrowed. Hence, it is a relatively, due to these simplifying assumptions, it is a relatively simple theory to understand and to employ and test in studies. However, as a result of its simplicity, some critics argue that it doesn't provide a deep and comprehensive understanding of the voluntary disclosure phenomenon by organizations. However, recent updates have been made to improve the theory and also to overcome some of its shortcomings in terms of the simplifying assumptions that it makes. So that is all for my presentation. I hope that you are able to understand what I have presented, and I hope that you are able to gain new knowledge about legitimacy theory. So that's all from me. Thank you.